Okay, thank you very much for this introduction, and also thank you very much for the invitation and to do this presentation. Well, maybe what I will do is to, before I give the presentation about student-teacher stress and well-being, I will introduce a bit about Leiden University and our credit school, and about myself. Well, I've already introduced very well, so that's quite clear, I think. So my research work is mostly on the intersection between technology, teaching, and social psychology. So it's a kind of combination, and that's so the topic of this presentation is right in that intersection of these three domains. Something about Leiden University, the oldest university of the Netherlands, about 30,000 students, a little bit more than 7,000 staff. It's a research university in the top 100, most of the lists, I think. And we have 7 faculties, both in Leiden and The Hague. So it's located in 2 cities in the Netherlands, which are quite near to each other. And I hope this introduction video, which is only a couple of minutes, will work. So let's try. And please let me know if you do not have any sound or something. And I will try the other one later. Okay. Well, that was meant to be an introduction clip of Leiden University, but you can have a look at it later.
Okay.
No, nothing is working anymore.
Yeah.
Not all the keys are working. Okay, and then within the Leiden University, I'm the director and work at the Credit School of Teaching, which is a kind of expertise center in teacher education and educational science in general. So what we have is a teacher education program in secondary education and in higher education. We have a further professional development program, both in secondary and higher education. We do a lot on curriculum development or curriculum science in general in both sections. And we have a quite large research program in teaching and teacher learning, both in secondary education again and in higher education. With about 50 PhDs and about 10 staff. And in the Netherlands, there are quite some routes to become a teacher. And the most important route in the university, so we have universities of applied sciences and research universities. And in the research universities, the main route to become a teacher are either do a graduate master program of 2 years or a postgraduate course of 1 year after your master's. And in both cases, it's 50% of the program, of the 1 year program, for instance, is being a teacher in school. So it's quite work-based program of becoming a teacher. And that is general for all our universities. So they offer more or less the same teacher education program. So that's more or less about some introduction of where I work, so the Leiden University and our credit school, and something about the teacher education programs. Then something about the structure, what I want to do today. So what I will do is say something about student-teacher stress and health. And then I will go into a little bit more detail about a particular old model, actually. It's from 1984, transactional model of stress and coping, and introduce the concepts of stress, appraisal, coping, and distress or well-being, which are included in that model. Then I will say something about a replication study we did on a typology of coping responses of student teachers, and go into more detail in teacher education interventions. And at the end, I would like to raise a more or less new concept of teacher immunity, which might be a solution of all the research we already did on concepts of stress appraisal, coping, well-being, which is very fragmented and very analytical. And the concept of teacher immunity might be a way forward to bring most of these concepts together. Well, some history about what already have been done on research on student-teacher stress. Well, there are many. You can have a look in the library for many studies on teacher stress and student-teacher stress. And originally, the research programs on student-teacher stress are based on that there was experienced a gap between the institutional program, so becoming a teacher in university, and the first experiences of as a beginning teacher in school. That's also what they call praxis shock or reality shock. And that was already in the 70s. And then we gradually tried to include more teaching practicum or teaching experiences within the teacher education program in order to prevent that student teachers again experience a praxis shock in practice, in school practice. So in other words, we actually wanted to include the praxis shock more into the teacher education program, but then also provide some guidance during the program. So that's a way of a start of most of the research on student-teacher stress. And I'm also not going to try to run this clip about teacher stress and health. I will put it later in the at the end of this presentation in the chat, and you can have a look at it. But generally, we see more or less 5 types of stresses. So stressful events of student teachers. So the events which are related to classroom management and classroom climate, events which are related to classroom instruction and the content of the lessons. So these two both are about the primary process of teaching. We have a type of stresses which are related to working in school and working with your colleagues. We have, in most countries, we have quite some stressful events related to profession, to the profession as a teacher. So for instance, in the Netherlands, it's not a very well-paid job. It's quite stressful. There are many tasks to do, and the status is also quite low. And more typical for student teachers is the 5th one, so which is the nexus between theory and practice. So the relationship between their teacher education program in the institute and the classroom practice or teaching practice in school. And of course, during teacher education, student teachers have to relate these 2 aspects to each other. So to understand what they learn in the institution, how to practice that in school, but also the other way around, what they practice in school, connect that to what they learn in the institute. And what I would like to do now is more to go into, actually the whole presentation is more about what teacher education programs can do about, instead of what's already done also in other places. It's kind of remedial programs like wellness programs or mindfulness programs, mentoring programs, that kind of things, which are more focused on the consequences of having stress and burnout than on how to cope with stressful events. Okay, so this is the general model I already announced. So it's the transactional model of stress and coping. On the left side, you see a stress. It's of course a simplified model of the whole process. So at the left side, you see a stressor or a stressful event. Then it will be appraised as whether it's stressful or not, which is the primary appraisal, and whether you can do something about it, which is the secondary appraisal, which leads to a way of coping with the whole event, which might lead, which has some consequences for burnout feelings or well-being feelings. What you already see is that the balance between primary appraisal and secondary appraisal is quite important, because that makes a particular event stressful or not. So if the primary appraisal is that it's quite negative, for instance, that you have some discipline problems with your students, but that you think you're able to do something about it, that might be less stressful than exactly the same event, which is also appraised as very negative, but also appraised as that you cannot do something about it. So the balance between primary appraisal and secondary appraisal is quite important. And if you then go to coping, more or less two types of copings in the literature. So coping styles or coping strategies which are more problem focused, and other types of strategies, coping strategies, which are more emotion focused. So the emotion focused ones are more related or focused on the consequences, burnout well-being, or the appraisal, and the problem focused types are more related to addressing the stressor itself. So changing, intervening with the classroom event, for instance, in this case, the discipline problems, and try to change it. It even becomes more complicated if you have a look at the burnout or well-being. So at the end, at the right side of the whole model, actually it's related to everything, because it is a consequence of everything, but it can also have an influence on all the aspects. If you do not feel well in your job, you might see more stressors, you might appraise stressful events as more negative, and you also might have not very effective coping strategies. So it's not burnout, and feelings of burnout and well-being are not only a consequence of the whole stress and coping process, but also influencing it, which makes it altogether quite complicated. And I want to say something about the replication study we did. So 20 years ago, we did more or less the same study, and now we replicated it after 20 years, actually with the same findings. So that might be not very, very positive, but on the other end, it's good replication. So what we did is having a small selection of student teachers from a one-year teacher education master program, the one which I already introduced with 50% school experience. We collected some data about class observations and stimulated recall interviews, and indicated, following the transactional model, indicating the events or stressors, the appraisals, coping, and effects in class. In a very short way, in the end, we distinguish two underlying dimensions, which are the avoidance approach dimension, dimensions of coping actions. So coping on the dimension of avoidance approach, and coping on the dimension of what I called calmness agitation or comfort dimension. And if we put it in a graph, we distinguish four types of coping strategies with stressful classroom events of student teachers. So problem solving, which is quite high on approaching the problem, and quite low or high in this case on calmness or comfort. Another type was the lower left one, so the avoiding type of coping strategies. Of course, high on avoidance, but also high on comfort or calmness. And the two types which were most occurring were the types of varying, so varying between problem solving and avoiding. So you have as a student teachers, you are, for instance, if you have discipline problems, you say something about it, you intervene, but you also, either before it or after it, are neglecting something and just continue with what you already did. So that's a varying type. And the hesitating type is on the right side, which is also in the middle of avoidance and approach, but it's quite high on agitation. And that's also quite common for beginning teachers or student teachers, that they really do not know what to do, and that they just stay there and freeze when they experience some discipline problems, not knowing what to do. So actually, what I already said, the varying and the hesitating types were the most occurring types. And of all these four types, the hesitating type was most problematic, because that these teachers who showed the hesitating type of coping with stressful events in class, they showed also the most problems and also the lowest scores on well-being later on. And what I had from conclude from this study, or both studies actually, also the replication, is that our teacher education program in general should be more focused on extending teaching repertoire instead of learning specific ways of coping. So a way to cope as a beginning teacher or a student teacher is that you have everything what you want to do or what you have to do, which is included in your repertoire, instead of trying to link some particular ways of coping to particular situations. And another one, and so the last conclusion is that in order to prevent feelings of stress as much as possible, we also have to promote some student teachers' well-being. So it's not that we only have to learn them to extend their teaching repertoire, but we also have to learn them to be relaxed, and also to have some positive feedback about what they do in class. So it's not only about problem-based coping, problem-focused coping. It is also should also be combined with emotion-focused coping. But what I already said, that the whole model or all the concepts are quite complicated because they are so interrelated. And therefore, one option could be, and that could also be a discussion, of course, or a point of discussion. One option could be to look at the more holistic side of coping and stress. And one concept which came into my mind is the concept of teacher immunity, which is first reported by Heifer and Dernier. And I put the most actually one of the recent articles just below. And teacher immunity is about a combination of 5 teacher qualities. So teaching self-efficacy, which is about the perceived effectiveness of your teaching. Teacher resilience, so the capacity to adapt to difficult circumstances. Attitudes towards teaching, so your general disposition toward teaching. Openness to change, so your receptivity to change or to change your classroom practice. And what they called classroom effectivity, so a general positive emotion in class. And what they did is based on a questionnaire study and on some focus group interviews, they try to explore this concept and also to relate it to what they called coping and burnout. So they use coping and burnout as a kind of criterion variable for teacher immunity. And in the end, they also come up with a typology. And they have very nice names for it. So you can have, if you read the article, you can also have a more extended description of all these types. So we have a type which is very high on all these 5 elements, what they call the spark plug, so the optimistic enthusiast. And we have a more or less similar type, but then a little bit less higher scores, what they call the visionary, or the innovative dreamer. Then they have a type which they call the fossilized teacher. So and that mostly means that teacher is stuck because of they put this label based on the moderate scores, but a very quite low score on openness to change. So the 4th type is the defeated teacher, with all overall low scores, but especially very low scores on openness to change. Sellout, so the teacher who's doing the bare minimum, also with very low scores on overall, but mostly on attitudes towards teaching. So it's quite negative attitude towards teaching. And the last one is what they call the overcompensator, which is the teacher who is experiencing imposter syndrome, so believing that you are not as competent as others perceive you to be. Also with moderate scores in general, but also high to openness to change. So actually the last one is, I would say, quite difficult to understand what they mean exactly with it. But that's also something maybe also for future research. So I think the other ones are quite clear, also quite clear from the study, but the last one is not that clear, also not that clear from the scores you see in the questionnaire. Maybe something about directions for future research. And that's also, of course, something we can discuss. And that's actually, we started last year, autumn, a smaller program or large project, depends how you say it, a large project on teacher immunity and what it means. So what we want to do is the following, is that we want to set up some studies about the reliability and validity of the study. So because it's not yet well examined, I think. And of course, how teacher immunity can be explained and what it can predict. So how it is related to stress, coping and burnout, etc. And of course, teacher immunity should also differentiate between teachers. So there should be teachers with high scores and teachers with low scores. Otherwise, and that should be also in a way that you would expect it. And we also will set up a study about how it can be improved and what should be done. So in teacher education, so an intervention study. And what would be nice to do, not yet in our project, is how it differs across educational systems and cultures. Because I understand that teacher education programs across countries are quite different, that it also means that the teacher immunity of student teachers can be quite different across countries. And of course, in the end, we should relate this whole more holistic concept of teacher immunity more to other models like the transactional model of stress and coping. So how does it relate? Does it really add something? Is it some additional value to have a concept like teacher immunity, or does it just add another model to the already existing models, which are also maybe not that clear? So these are some directions for future research. And if you have some questions or comments, well, we have some time left for comments, I think. And maybe even a little bit, I can stop here a little bit sooner than expected because of the clips, but
okay.
I think